Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Southern Rockies Landscape Conservation Cooperative webinar. My name is Mary McFadden. I'll be hosting today's event. I'm the Communications and Science Outreach Specialist for the Southern Rockies LCC. With us today is Megan Friggens. Megan works with the U.S. Forest Service Rocky Mountain Research Station in Albuquerque, and she'll be presenting on the final vulnerability assessments for species and ecosystems in the Four Corners region and Upper Rio Grande. So Megan, we're ready to go if you are.
All right, I think I am. Thank you. Okay, so thank you everybody for tuning in today. This is our potential last formal webinar, of which we've had many on these vulnerability assessments. And so I think I would like to begin. Oops, this is not moving forward. Hold on a second. Oh, there we go. Okay, by acknowledging the team and contributors to this effort, because there's been a lot of folks that have been really important for completing these assessments and providing feedback and help in a variety of ways. So first of all, we have a number of assessments that I'll talk about today. Max Smith was our primary author of the Riparian and cold water fish assessments. Mary Williams conducted the Sagebrush assessment. Zyda Wasserman, the elk and mule deer. Stephanie Mueller from NEU has helped a lot with compiling our spatial data and doing some of the analyses. We have Dave Hawksworth from RMRS, and he's our kind of everything guy, so he's been very helpful. And then I really want to acknowledge the staff at Southern Rockies LCC. They've, of course, sponsored this effort, but they've been also a really great group to work with, always very patient and politely nodding no matter what kind of crazy stuff you might throw at them. So really great group. And then, of course, last but not least, all those folks who have participated in our Adaptation Forum workshops, the working group and science committee meetings, who let me tag along to their meetings and let me question them and talk with them about various things. You've been all so important for this effort. And I'm hearing a little bit of feedback, so I hope you guys are hearing this okay. But also I want to acknowledge those folks that not only went to one adaptation forum and maybe helped facilitate, but also went to both. So they were real gluttons for punishment, and I really appreciate all of your contributions. And so it's been a really great project to work on and great people to work with. So what I'm going to do today in this webinar to kind of close up the project is not necessarily throw a bunch of results at you. We have a lot of webinars where we've already talked in great detail about this process and about the results. So today's webinar is really going to be focused on the vulnerability assessments and the related products that come out of those assessments. And so I want to go over what they are, provide some background in case we have a lot of people new to the project on the phone today. And then I'm going to talk about where we can find them and how we can use them. And so that's really the focus of today's talk. And if you're interested in more details, you can look at the reports themselves. I'll be presenting on the Riparian results at a meeting next week at the Tamarask Coalition meeting. As well, we have webinars that are recorded and in PDF format, and I will show you all that as this presentation today proceeds. Excuse me. So what we're talking about are vulnerability assessments that have been conducted for 5 focal resources in 2 landscapes. And so let me see if I can get my pointer to work here. Hold on a second, sorry. Okay, can you guys see that? I hope you can. So we have 2 landscapes that are the focus of this particular project, the Four Corners here and the Upper Rio Grande. There are some similar efforts going on in the Green River Basin, and I think some initial efforts in the Colorado Plateau, so there's some other projects as well. For what we're talking about today, though, we are looking at the Four Corners and Upper Rio Grande. So we have conducted vulnerability assessments for Pinyon-Juniper Ecosystems, Sagebrush Ecosystems, native fish, and riparian corridors, and so this is actually 2 different assessment product or write-ups and outputs, and then Mule Deer and Elk, which have been combined into one assessment. So these are the 5 different assessments we have, and all of these have been completed, and you can, well, I should back up there. The Pinyon-Juniper is still in the works. It's going to be out very soon, but all of the others, you can find the final reports on the LCC website and in some other locations that I'll show you. So those are completed and ready for use. Okay, hold on a second. Okay. All right, so this project that we were really focused on, the vulnerability assessment component, it had a number of objectives that have utility perhaps in a larger or broader perspective. And so our goals or objectives with respect to this project were, one, to review the current status and ongoing activities for those focal resources within each landscape, to identify the relevant spatial data that is available that we could use to assess vulnerability and identify conservation opportunities at a landscape scale. And then, more specific to the vulnerability assessment, we wanted to develop a framework for creating spatially explicit products that identified vulnerabilities in these landscapes, and then once we had developed the system, to actually demonstrate the application by assessing the focal resources. Yeah, sorry, it doesn't want me, it won't let my mouse go out of the screen once I use this. How do I do that? Okay. Okay, Mary, I'm having technical difficulties. There we go. Okay. Okay, so why vulnerability assessments? I talk about these a lot. And so essentially what we have here, vulnerability assessments are a really good system or tool for organizing and communicating complex information. And so we have climate-related stressors and non-climate stressors. We have interacting species and shifting ecosystems. And so vulnerability assessments are a method for really organizing this information. They also enable us to take into account uncertainties, and there's a variety of ways that that can be done, and I'll show you a little bit how we address that here. And they're usually a first step towards identifying adaptation options, and so that's kind of where the Southern Rockies LCC is going with this effort. And then finally, we have conducted these spatially explicit vulnerability assessments so that we can develop landscape-level outputs. So here is the timeline of this project as we've had it right now. Okay, I think I see what's going on with this pointer. So the project began in 2015, and once we established what we wanted to do, that we were going to create these spatially explicit vulnerability assessments and kind of review the status of what's going on with the focal resources, we began our data collection, identifying spatial data sets and gathering together, as well as our literature review, which is included in each of the final reports. In the spring of 2016, there was an initial series of adaptation forums, one for the Four Corners area and one for the Upper Rio Grande. And these were facilitated by the Colorado Natural Heritage Program. And there was a number of objectives at these forums, but from the perspective of what we were doing with the vulnerability assessments, we really tried to get some feedback about the focal resources, our targets of the vulnerability assessments, and on the data and potential indicators. And so from that, we did change our targets a little bit. We added Pinyon-Juniper and Riparian corridors as were the initial focal resources on the list. And cultural resources was dropped from this effort and is now the focus of an independent effort to address those, and I think that's its own project entirely. And so taking some of the feedback we got from these adaptation forums, we began to produce our preliminary assessments for those 5 focal resources that I identified earlier. And so during this time, we continued to gather data and then kind of troubleshoot our system and how we were putting together things. And we pretty much had them together by the summer of 2017. And we were really, at this time, preparing for a second series of adaptation forums that occurred in the fall of 2017 that would be focused pretty much entirely on those vulnerability assessments. So we did precede the second series of adaptation forums with a webinar series where we rolled out in some detail the methods for each of the vulnerability assessments and the initial results, showing a lot of maps and things like that. Those are available online if you want to see them, and they can really provide a lot of good background information. During the second Adaptation Forums, we asked participants to give us feedback on the assessments. What worked, what didn't work, what should we change, how can we improve these to make them more useful. And then we started to use them to identify priorities or actions that we may be able to take with respect to each of the focal resources. And I'll highlight some of those results towards the end of this presentation today. And so right now we're at this stage, early 2018. We are uploading those final assessments, and again we have 4 of the 5 finished and already uploaded and available. We're also uploading the various data products, which I'll explain in some detail in a few moments here. And so I continue over the next maybe 2 or 3 weeks, and then we'll probably have everything available and ready to go. So the outcome of all these efforts can be really thought of as these 3 things. So first of all, we have what maybe I would call as a library of spatial data sets representing threats and issues and conditions summarized by either the Huck 12 watershed or stream reach. And so we have things related to climate and non-climate stressors, spatial data sets that were available where we can use this information to measure potential threats. We have data regarding condition and status of resources, and then things that relate to resiliencies, and I'll detail that a little bit better in another slide. Then we have our vulnerability assessment framework for use with the spatial data, and then finally we have vulnerability assessment for the 5 focal resources. And so let me take this to the next slide. So we use this, here I'm kind of showing you a diagram, sorry it keeps disappearing on me, a diagram of that library of our climate, non-climate stressor, condition status, resiliencies, data sets. And how this really works is that you're going to, for whatever your focal resource of interest and your time period of interest, because we do have projections for future conditions at different time periods, you're going to select the data that's relevant for your focal resource in that time period, and then use the framework to develop these spatially explicit vulnerability assessment products. Now, if you have different resources or different time periods of interest, you'll simply just select different subsets of this data. And indeed, that's how we developed the 5 vulnerability assessments that okay, yeah, thank you. The 5 vulnerability assessments that we produced here. And you'll see if you look at those webinars or read the reports, some of the vulnerability assessments have used similar data, and then they'll have data that's unique to that particular focal resource because it's important to it. For instance, wildfire potential, that one is used in almost all of our vulnerability assessments as an indicator of exposure. So this library of data sets can also be used for other purposes. You don't necessarily need to use the framework that we use to develop vulnerability assessment products, but you could use and take this data and use it in other efforts like risk assessments, or if you're involved in climate smart conservation. You may just want to use it in workshops that aren't necessarily focused on vulnerability at all, but just want to focus on threats and issues or something like that. And then, of course, landscape conservation design. So this whole system that we've produced has a lot of flexibility in how you can use it. And we have produced these vulnerability assessments for focal resources, but you can use the framework or just the data for a variety of other purposes outside of what we've done. So hopefully you do find some value in the actual assessments that we've conducted as well. So when I'm talking about a vulnerability assessment framework, I'm simply talking about how we're organizing the information. And so our framework here, this is a diagram, is based on a really common framework for looking at climate change vulnerability excuse me. And it's composed of these elements of exposure, or your degree of change, and your sensitivity, or your response to that change. And collectively, these represent the impact to your resource. And then vulnerability considers how susceptible your resource will be to that impact with respect to its capacity to adapt to those changes. And so again, this assessment framework is a way to organize a large amount of information in a system where we can start to get relative measures of vulnerability and identify where exactly that vulnerability is coming from. Is it the exposure or sensitivity or adaptive capacity? So how this works with the spatial data sets is that we use the spatial data measures to, well, I guess I should say, let's say we're looking at that library of data. And what you're going to do is you're going to select your indicator data sets that represent either exposure or sensitivity or adaptive capacity. And so here we're seeing a slide that I borrowed from Max's presentation on cold water fish habitat. And it's demonstrating 3 different indicators of exposure. So change in August stream temperature, change in mean summer flow, and change in mean annual flow. So these were selected to represent exposure. So the next step is to reclassify this data into a 0 or no effect or a 1 and effect. And we need to do this because a lot of these underlying data sets are continuous measures, but it's really not, we need to identify where along that continuous measurement it actually is going to be a negative effect, since we're talking about exposure here. So this is too small for me to see the numbers, but let's say in this middle area we decide any value, any change or loss in mean annual flow above a certain value is very likely to have a negative impact, whereas anything below that level is less likely or maybe unlikely to have a negative impact. And so we determine these thresholds through literature or discussions with experts or just our best estimate given kind of the understanding of the system, and reclassify these into like a 0-1 type data layer. And then these are simply added up to create what we call our cumulative exposure index. And so you do this for exposure, you do this for a unique set of indicators of sensitivity, and you do this for adaptive capacity. And so in this map, I know that there's some high exposure areas, or the kind of warmer colors up in this area. And so those are areas where there's multiple factors affecting, multiple potential negative exposure factors affecting them. And then areas that are highlighted in blue maybe have 1 or none exposure factors affecting them. So where we go with this is that you end up, and this is actually showing us results from the Riparian Four Corners data set now. You end up with a map of exposure, this is cumulative exposure, and a map of sensitivity. And these are combined to create that impact, if you recall from that earlier diagram. And then you also calculate your adaptive capacity based on your adaptive capacity indicators. And then you classify each of your watersheds or stream reaches. You classify their vulnerability according to where they stand with respect to adaptive capacity and impact. So where you have high impact and low adaptive capacity, you're going to have high vulnerability. And where you have high adaptive capacity and low impact, you'll have very low vulnerability. And so you get this output here. And so I hear a little bit of something going on, but maybe it's not too bad. So this is essentially our assessment outputs, your analysis of exposure, your analysis of sensitivity, impact, adaptive capacity, and then, of course, vulnerability. And so this is an overview of what the project is and how we got there. Again, there's webinars that talk a lot more in detail about how we add these things up and produce these outputs. Right now, I'm going to shift to where you can find this information and then how you can use it. So we have a number of assessment products, or maybe I should just call this project products. Well, we have those data sets, that kind of library that I was talking about, and then we have a large number of maps. These data sets both pertain to... Okay, yeah, I'm hearing the audio too. I'm making sure nobody was saying my audio was bad. Okay, it says the audio is really bad.
Megan, that was
okay.
Megan, this
is
Mary.
It cool?
That was Megan, this is Mary. Brian posted that a little bit earlier. And just a reminder, please, you guys, mute your phones. If you're hearing both echo from your computer, you need to shut off your computer speakers. That's this quirky thing with Adobe Connect. So either use your computer speakers or your phone. Thank you.
Okay, cool. And so I see too a question by Robin, were all the stressors set as either 0 and 1? Yes, we did a simple effect, no effect, and I would be happy to talk about that later. We can weight things, but that's really, well, maybe I should talk about that later rather than break up the flow, but that there's an innumerable number. There's so many ways that we can put this together. And so for our demonstration and for these assessments, we went with a very straightforward additive process. Okay, so assessment products. We have our data sets and maps. And so the data sets are available for the original process data. So for instance, we have road density, and so that was estimated and then summarized by those HUC-12. So we have average road density per HUC-12. That kind of data is available, as well as data files associated with the specific assessments. And so those will have all the different indicator data sets included in them that were used in the estimate of adaptive capacity or exposure or anything. So it's kind of a all-in-one file. We have accessory documents for those data sets. There's the metadata that's associated with the files themselves, but then we also have some tables and Excel files that present them in sometimes a more easy-to-read format. We have the vulnerability assessment reports, and both the data sets and the vulnerability assessment reports are highlighted because these are really the big products from this, and this is your go-to resource for everything, these reports. They have everything in them. We have webinar recordings, including this one, and then we have our workshop reports. And so I will talk about where we can get these in a little bit more detail about each of them. So this slide is showing us some examples of the data sets that we have compiled and that were used in our vulnerability assessments. And so we have climate change, disturbance, and threat indicators. These often were used in our assessments to represent exposure. And so I'm just showing you some of the things that we had in some of our assessments. This is not a complete list. I don't know that we have a complete list, but we do have them listed for each of the assessments. Then we have what we called our susceptibility indicators. So these are data that represent maybe conditions or situations on the ground that may affect how sensitive a resource is to exposure to these various things up here. Then we have a set of value indicators, and so this kind of regards that notion that certain things are going to cost, there's a cost associated, or there's different costs associated with different resources, and such that if you had some exposure to some disturbance or threat, where you have threatened and endangered species, that is actually, you're going to be more sensitive to that in that area because there's more value. I don't know if I described that better. I've done better perhaps in the past, but hopefully that's making sense. So these are the kind of indicators that we often use to measure sensitivity. And then, of course, we have adaptive capacity, which you can consider from kind of those more intrinsic traits, kind of inverse sometimes of the susceptibility, things that maybe will help a resource or ecosystem bounce back or resist some of the negative impacts of these threats and issues. And then there's adaptive capacity in the sense of management potential. Are we able to initiate actions? Are there already maybe conservation easements in effect that can help us reduce some of the potential impacts of changes in urbanization or something like that. So again, these are just some of the examples. For those of you that are really paying attention to this, you might notice that some of these things could be used as measures of exposure or sensitivity. They're not necessarily hard, they're not permanently classified in any one of these characteristics or any one of these categories. It really depends on your target and the goals of your vulnerability assessment or whatever you might be doing with the data, how you use them. The important thing is that you are using them and it helps you identify where you have issues or potential opportunities. And so If you look through the various reports that we've done here, you'll see that some things like road density, I don't think I have that listed here actually, oh yeah I do, are actually treated differently in different assessments depending on how we decided to measure it. And in particular, you can really, assessments for species and ecosystems will often differ, ecosystems focusing a lot on this management potential and species level assessments often focusing on more trait-based, intrinsic kind of things. So anyways, these are the data sets that, and there's more as well, but these are examples of the type of spatial data that's already been summarized and is available for the entire LCC, not just the focal regions. So you can get these data sets at 2 different locations. You can look to the ScienceBase catalog, which is a really great site for finding data and reports on a wide variety of projects. And then you can look at the Conservation Planning Atlas, which is associated with the Southern Rockies web page. Here we go. So ScienceBase can hold not only the data, but it can hold some of those associated documents. And so you can find the final reports and the tables and some interactive PDFs that I'll talk about in a minute from the ScienceBase connection. And so if you go into ScienceBase, you can simply search for the Southern Rockies Landscape Conservation Cooperative, and then under that navigate to the landscape planning projects, and you'll find our I shouldn't say our, it has other projects in here as well, but the focal areas of this project right here at the Four Corners and Upper Rio Grande. You can also find information on the other landscapes for which the LCC has activities going on. And so I have the web address here in case you just wanted to go directly to it. And this will be recorded, so you don't necessarily have to write it all down right now, but there is a direct connection to this. And that link actually will take you to this area. So here is the Four Corners Upper Rio Grande Adaptation Forums, and so there is a data folder, and you click this, and it's simply, very Explorer kind of based list of file names, and then you have your documents, so all your Word documents or your PDF or whatnot here. And then there's files for each of the specific landscapes, and this is where you'll find some of the assessment outputs because they are divided by each of the focal resources. So there's the Four Corners, and there is a Upper Rio Grande specific set of data. Okay, so that's ScienceBase. Really great resource. It's pretty easy to navigate, really quick to download stuff. The other source that you can find information is the Conservation Planning Atlas, and you can navigate to this. This website is a little bit shorter and easier to jot down, but you can navigate to it just by going to the Southern Rockies LCC main web page. And so they have a pretty easy link to follow. And the CPA is really good for visualizing data on the fly, and it is going to regard only the spatial data. You're not going to find the reports or anything here, but it is, hold on a second, a really good place for looking at that spatial data. So this is what it looks like if you clicked on the Conservation Planning Atlas for the Southern Rockies, and they organize their information by these galleries. And so if we, oops, sorry guys, so you can see here is the Upper Rio Grande and Four Corners Adaptation Forum galleries, and if you went to those, you open up this page, which gives you a nice description of what's going on. It's kind of this background, and then it also shows you that you have 20 data sets in here, and this is what the data sets look like. So you just scroll down to find this. And so here we have, these were the data sets that were produced for our final adaptation forum, and we use these for our exercises. They will soon be replaced by the actual final files. The final files are being uploaded onto the ScienceBase, and then I'll link them in here. But for now, we have these files in here, and all the final files will say final on them, so that's important, I guess, to distinguish. I don't know what happened to the Sagebrush, but anyways, we have these files organized by vulnerability, and then we have the sensitivity, adaptive capacity, and exposure are grouped together, and that's so that you can visualize this in the CPA easier, because it'll actually, if you clicked on one of those, we'll show you the data like this, but then you can open it in a map and be able to change the settings and overlay things and adjust transparency and look at it on the fly quite easily. You can also download the data here, and it does show you for each file what it contains. So this is for the riparian sensitivity for the 4 corners, and these are all the different indicators that were used to estimate sensitivity for this particular set of data, and this corresponds to tables that you can find in the final reports and in accessory documents that outline what the data actually are, what the original range of values were, how we translated that, and then how many watersheds were affected by that. So it's a very easy way to quickly look at the spatial data and explore it. And this discussion of the tables helps me go right to, I think, the most important thing, that if you're interested in these products or the methods, the final reports, which contain everything. And so I'm going to use Max's final report as our example report of what these contain, but we have these for each of the focal resources. Again, though the cold water fish habitat and the riparian corridors, they have their own individual assessments, but they're in this single report because they had a lot of overlap, and so it just made more sense to keep them together. But there are 2 series of assessment products from them. So each of these reports for each of the focal resources differs a little bit because they had different targets and different issues at hand, and given feedback from various participants, maybe a slightly different focus. But they all have a background section that talks about vulnerability assessments and the history of this project and things like that. They all have a literature and status review, so kind of an overview of what's going on in the 2 focal areas of interest, who is doing what, up to the point of are completing these projects. At least there will be ongoing activities and things like that, background and status, and this is how this particular one is organized. And then, of course, we have the vulnerability assessment itself, and so it details methods, it has results, and there's a discussion. And so the results are where you can find the maps and some summaries about where vulnerability and exposures were greatest and least. The discussion talks a little bit about interpreting those results and talks about uncertainties and how we can use this information. And then for this particular assessment, there are 3 appendices that outline a lot of information about the actual indicator data sets and things like that. But all of them have this, it just might be organized differently. So this is an example of one of the tables. They all outline a list of the available spatial data for this area and other areas for the particular focal resource. And there's, for hydrology, I think that there's other lists like this, but for the elk and mule deer and the Pinyon-Juniper, I think these tables are really useful for identifying and consolidating some of these sources. Oops, I keep trying to forward in the wrong place. We have maps of the actual indicator data sets, and so what you're seeing here is the riparian corridors exposure indicators that have been translated into those 0-1, so you can see which watersheds were affected by a particular indicator used for exposure. And this is the final report, so if this looks different from what I showed you earlier, that's because it's been modified and updated and improved. And then here's another example of some of the underlying data that was used to generate this particular report. We discuss in depth each of those indicators. We talk about where you can find it or where we got it, a brief description. We give a justification for why that was included in this particular analysis, and then we talk a little bit about how we downloaded it, how we processed it, how we translated it into an effect, no effect layer. And then where there was good information, we talk about the uncertainties at this level, what's good and what's not good about this particular data set and what you should be aware of when you're using it. And then, of course, we have all of our vulnerability assessment products. So this is a vulnerability, however these go, it's probably, I don't know, so adaptive capacity, sensitivity, and exposure. So you get a lot of information with these reports, and they are going to be your main source for understanding these maps, I think, and identifying what the data is and where it came from and how it's translated. And that's really important for interpreting how we can use them. We've also created these interactive PDF files, and these are available on the ScienceBase right now, and you can find them. And so we have PDFs here. This is for the Sagebrush. And what these are standalone products that show you all of those different result maps. So we have the exposure, sensitivity, adaptive capacity, impact, and vulnerability. And so there's a symbol right here that indicates the layers, and so you can click these on and off. So it's essentially showing you 5 figures in one PDF document, and you can click them on and off and kind of assess the information without having to be on the CPA or in some ArcMap program or something like that. This is an example of some of the other data that we've made available. So there's been a lot of work done on individual pinyon and juniper species, and we don't include that necessarily in our assessment calculation, but we do talk about this in the Pinyon-Juniper report. And so we've also thought this was useful information for creating these interactive PDFs where you can look at over time the change in the distribution of climate suitable for a particular species by this analysis. And so there's lots of good stuff like that you can find. So again, where can you find these? The spatial data sets, the reports, the PDFs, and those kinds of things, you should look to the ScienceBase catalog. That's our main source there. If you want to visualize and download the spatial data, go to the CPA. It's really easy to access, very nice interface for exploring that kind of stuff. So I also want to highlight the Southern Rockies web page itself for our source of other information like the presentations, the webinar recordings, our workshop reports. This is the main kind of clip from the main page of the Southern Rockies web page, and if you go to our focus, you can see the landscape conservation design is organized around these different landscapes, and there's our 4 corners in Upper Rio Grande. If you click on one of those, here we have the 4 corners, you get a nice little bit of background and kind of the overall picture. These vulnerability assessments are just part of the vision, I think, of where these things are going. And so this is a nice source of information to have. And more importantly, it has oodles of great links to a variety of things. So there's presentations here on a variety of topics, talking about some workshop stuff, but also a nice one by Kevin Johnson on landscape conservation design, a great presentation by Molly Cross that talks about where you go once you've had the vulnerability assessment. Then we have a variety of presentations and kind of these brief write-ups that we used at the workshops that can provide you a quick view of the results and things. These are available here. The final reports you can link to directly from here as well as from the ScienceBase. There's a link to the Conservation Planning Atlas if you want to look at the data. And then these webinars here are, this involves that rollout that we did prior to the second round of Adaptation Forums. And soon, hopefully by the end of the day, we'll have the second workshop report up here. And I didn't point it out, but the 2016 workshop report is on this site too. It's just up, you can't see it right now. So this is where you can go to find all this kind of background information and some presentations and things like that. So the final part of this that I guess I wanted to cover is how do we use these vulnerability assessments, kind of where do we go from here? And so we really began to explore this question during the 2017 Adaptation Forums. And this is a process that we hope to be able to continue with another series of Adaptation Forums potentially in 2018. And so that would be the goal. And it really centers around looking at these results, and I like this graphic. This is from GTR 87 that shows us the kind of the spectrum of vulnerability, high, moderate, low, and how that relates to adaptive capacity and potential impacts, where you have high impact and you're going to have high vulnerability. And high adaptive capacity can really leave you in a better position of low vulnerability. So essentially, what these assessments tell us for the 5 focal resources, or any assessment, are where resources are most vulnerable and how resources are vulnerable. And it's with this information that we can start to identify actions and adaptation strategies to reduce vulnerability. So how do we use this information? There's a number of different ways. And again, I'm going to show you an example shortly here of where it went in our adaptation forums, but I do want to point out that there's several guidelines and approaches for developing adaptation options. Essentially, though, it all boils down to identifying priorities and needs and identifying actions. And that can take many forms. You know, here's a really nice graphic that I borrowed from Dave Theobald. He's doing a similar effort in the Green River Basin. And it's showing you where you can take vulnerability, where you have high vulnerability, and just start to identify actions. You know, we need immediate actions in these areas and certain types of actions. Let's maintain connectivity. That's going to be really important. Versus areas maybe that have lower vulnerability, where you can focus on monitoring and maybe more of a wait and watch kind of situation. And so this is a really nice initial way to think about vulnerability assessment. Of course, we have these spatial outputs, and so this really helps us identify where on our landscapes vulnerability is greatest and least. And so if we look at these areas, we can say, well, let's prioritize actions in these areas of high vulnerability. You know, we can see this in both our focal areas. But maybe also you would want to focus some actions on areas of low vulnerability to preserve what's good and identify a refugia. And so it really depends on your focal resource and on your capacity to implement or change whatever is driving this vulnerability. We can also look at the elements of vulnerability and start to identify maybe areas where we could focus on reducing exposure and some of the threats. And again, you could also look at these areas that appear to be less threatened and say, well, let's keep it that way. You know, there's 2 ways to look at this, but kind of in that same sentiment, we can think about facilitating adaptive capacity. So this is looking at riparians. Those last 2 is looking at the sagebrush. But we can look at these areas that appear to have high adaptive capacity and identify ways that we can preserve some of that integrity of these landscapes up here. Or we can identify areas perhaps where we need to facilitate greater adaptive capacity in whatever ways that it might be relative to a particular resource. So I'm going to reference this GTR again, number 87 here, because they really talk at length about vulnerability assessments and adaptation options. And I think they make a really good point here that as we go through and are dealing with all the various situations and issues that we are in these landscapes, it's going to be increasingly important to prioritize our actions based not only on where we can find that, where we need to, where there's the greatest need because it's the most vulnerable or it's a refugia, but on our likelihood to reduce vulnerability, which really relates to what we can leverage on the landscape. So many of these products that we've produced here are likely best used by associating them with other data, perhaps on where conservation is already being prioritized, so that we can identify areas where our efforts are going to be most effective. And so I'm going to kind of demonstrate this with some of the outcomes of the adaptation forums that we had. Once we've identified those areas and maybe the strategies that we want to or excuse me, the areas and what we need to do in those areas, then we need to start to identify our adaptation strategies and actions. And so during the Adaptation Forums, I mentioned this earlier, but we focused on getting feedback on the vulnerability assessments so we could kind of finalize and change them up and make them hopefully more useful for everybody that might be interested in them. But then we also asked participants to start to use them to identify needs and actions for each of those focal resources based on the output. And so I wanted to highlight some of this discussion because I think that it was really interesting. We did this as much to help provide training on how to use these assessment products as to actually get some information on these actions, but I think we've gotten a lot of really interesting information that will be summarized in a workshop report that, again, I'm trying to get up there hopefully by the end of today, so we'll see how that goes. But the example I'm going to talk about is from the Four Corners Adaptation Forum, and it was the Riparian group. And so each of the breakout groups that we had, which were associated with each of those focal resources, took different perspectives. Some groups focused on these results to identify specific areas in the landscape, and that's what this Riparian corridor group did. Others focused on those individual elements of vulnerability, and so they said, oh, we really need to reduce exposure. That's what's driving all the vulnerability that we're seeing in this area, or sensitivity is the issue. And so then they would focus on actions to reduce exposure and sensitivity. But for the Riparian corridor group, they really saw an opportunity to identify specific areas. And so what we asked them to do was to brainstorm priorities and needs based on these results, and then by the end of the day to whittle it down to the top 3 priorities. And so this is what they came up with: to support and enhance riparian buffers via incremental water storage to enhance local water resources and water recharge in the Little Colorado River region. Secondly, they thought to reduce exposure and increase adaptive capacity for free-flowing San Juan River tributaries to protect natural river functions, and then finally to protect headwater environments of the San Juan Mountains to maintain and enhance hydrological drivers and ecosystem services now and into the future. And so once these priority statements were made, then we went through this exercise where the entire forum participants, so not in breakout groups, but everybody was able to brainstorm various actions that might help achieve this priority need. And so if we look at that first statement, support, enhance riparian buffers, this is showing us, or I put up here, essentially all of the different actions that resulted from this brainstorming activity. And I pretty much put them up here as they were written, so if there's some odd writing or shorthand, that's why, though I did have to shorten some of this to make it fit. But what they came up with from the discussion of the vulnerability assessments and then the brainstorming activity were a number of kind of restoration techniques that could help achieve this goal. They identified some knowledge gaps, you know, the extent of TAM risk and what's going on in this area with respect to other partnerships and activities. They talked about some needs for maybe new research, specific types of studies and monitoring programs. And they also talked quite a bit about public education campaigns. And actually with this particular group, outreach was a really strong focus in a number of their priorities that they listed. They kept coming around to this idea. But then you can see various other things, developing adapt and manage protocols with the stakeholders, assist with migration, initiate best grazing best management practices, and et cetera, et cetera. So anyways, this is an example of one way that we can use the vulnerability assessment products that were produced as part of this project to generate adaptation strategies and options. There's many, many guidelines and what I'm calling libraries available to help identify adaptation actions through a variety of ways. And so here is that GTR that I was mentioning that I think has a really good discussion, and I borrowed some graphics from it for this presentation. They actually list all of these other different sources of information and strategies, and your organization may have their own strategies for developing that, and this should be amendable to all that. And again, you're going to have this library of data sets so that you can create new products if you wanted to on different focal resources or in different ways. One that I want to really point out, though, just to show you a different example, we did this brainstorming session at workshops to develop some ideas specific to our focal resources, but there are resources out there, and in particular, I wanted to point out this Adaptation Partnership one, and I'm sorry that's cut off a little bit, but this is the main address. I will get you there. This is a partnership that has been working with the forests a lot, developing climate change vulnerability assessments, so it's kind of focused on climate change, obviously, it's in their title. But they have been conducting a large number of workshops in various forests throughout the western U.S. and even with some other groups. And at each of these workshops, they too ask participants to brainstorm potential adaptation strategies and tactics given certain threats and issues. And then they've been compiling it into this database that you can find online. And so it's pretty nifty. Here you have all of the potential categories as to how they're organizing it. And I hope you can see this, but this is showing us those categories again, and I've selected something for the fisheries. And so if you click on that, it shows you a number of sensitivities to climate change, and these were identified through their workshops and their vulnerability assessments. So increased flood frequency and higher peak flows may reduce egg fry survival. Lower flows will reduce fish habitat quality, et cetera, et cetera. You know, they have many of them. I clicked on the lower flows will increase pre-spawn mortality for summer run and stream-type salmon and steelhead. And then under that, they happen to just have a single adaptation strategy for this particular sensitivity, but often they'll have more than one. And if you click on that, it actually has specific tactics. So they kind of have this hierarchy here where you go from kind of the general category to sensitivities here, and then particular strategies and tactics. And so this is a resource that I imagine would be useful for a variety of different efforts, and it's just an example of one of many of the resources that are out there that can help you identify these types of actions given some vulnerability assessment. So hopefully it is planned to potentially have another series of adaptation forums where we can begin to move forward more seriously on linking these vulnerability assessments with conservation actions, and to develop a library of potential management actions specific to these landscapes and to the stakeholders who work within these landscapes. Now, I have stay tuned here because given some of the budget situation stuff going on or lack of budget, this is still, we're uncertain as to how this may progress, but it is what we would like to have happen, and it is a tentative plan. So that's pretty much what I wanted to talk to you about today. We have a lot of data and information available, especially with respect to these focal resources, but we also have a lot of data that's probably useful and relevant for other focal resources, as well as other types of activities. We also have a demonstration of how you can use spatial data products with a vulnerability assessment framework to develop products that can help you identify adaptation actions. For each of these focal resources, we have the reports, maps, and workshop outcomes. So that example I showed you for the Riparian Four Corners workshop, we have priorities, actions, and then final top 3 action summary for each of them at each of the focal landscapes. There's a lot of focuses in this thing. So if you want to access any of these products, you can go to the Southern Rockies website, and I think Mary has been busily typing all these links, so that's awesome. Hers are much nicer than mine as far as links. You can look to the Conservation Planning Atlas if you just want to dive in and check out what it looks like, see if it will work for you or not. And then, of course, ScienceBase is a catch-all resource, I think. And please check back frequently as we continue to update and upload these files. We just, it's hot off the press, so we're just updating all of these data sources, and we could send out an update or whatnot. But check back, because it's going to continue to roll in over the next few weeks. Okay, so that's all I have for you today, and here's my links that I have, and some cool graphic stuff. I don't know what I'm doing there. Okay, I'm going to turn this thing off. So please always, too, feel free to get a hold of me if you need any help with anything in interpreting this. I am here to talk with you. Also, the individual authors of the various assessments are definitely going to be important subject matter experts, and so we are available and would love to help you adapt these things for your planning processes. So I think I'm ready for questions.
Yeah. Thanks, Megan, for the great overview. Yeah, folks, if you have we have a few minutes for questions. You can either type them in as Randy just did, or you're welcome to unmute yourself or your computer mic and ask a question verbally. So, Megan, maybe you want to start with Randy's question?
Yeah, so the PJ, I know, I want the PJ to be done. It's really, there's such awesome information about Pinyon-Juniper out there. So I'm going to say 2 weeks. I can get this together in 2 weeks. I suspect that I know that the actual data, the maps of vulnerability exposure, and that stuff will be up before that report that contains the synthesis of ongoing activities and background and status. And so now that this webinar and we're kind of closing up the project, I can pull my attention back to that and get that out. But the data is coming very quickly.
Hey, Mary, this is Kevin. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So for the folks on the phone, this is Kevin Johnson. I'm with the Southern Rockies LCC. And some of you might have tuned in to this webinar expecting or hoping that we'd have more discussion about what the end results of the vulnerability assessments are in terms of, what is it that these maps are telling us. And we really wanted to kind of highlight where the data is and how the vulnerability assessments came about, because a lot of the interpretation of these maps is also specific to your objectives and what you're trying to do within your programs and what your various conservation delivery actions are. So it really is an opportunity here for you to go in and look at the maps. They're pretty straightforward. Megan identified very well, I think, on the webinar today, the data sets that went into it and how these end vulnerability assessments were developed. And so the maps are pretty straightforward. You can look at them and you can begin to just already sit and look at them and make determinations and decisions about some possible areas to either collaborate or work individually across this landscape to address these vulnerabilities. So I just wanted to point out that that's why we really did dig into what the vulnerability assessment said, because like I say, it really does depend upon what you're trying to achieve individually.
Yeah, thanks for that, Kevin. I know that also it would be an overwhelming number of map pictures I'd be showing you because there's a lot of information, but yes.
Yeah, folks, if you're there, I see you're having problems with your unmuting your mic, but you could type that you're in a new question if you can't figure out how to turn it on.
Oh, I got it.
Yay!
So automatically I'm already downloading stuff and looking at the shapefiles, and I'm looking at the attributes table for adaptive capacity, and I kind of just wanted to know if the general thing was 0 means kind of no impact and 3 or higher means, high impact when you have those for the adaptive capacity, or for any of them really.
Yeah, so so the exposure and the sensitivity, the 1 and the higher the score, the more exposure, the more sensitivity. With adaptive capacity, the higher the score, the greater adaptive capacity, the greater the number of factors are present within that particular watershed or stream reach. And so, yeah, does that answer kind of where you were going?
Yeah, and whenever that the PEJ vulnerability assessment comes available, would that have it kind of laid out in there, or is that something that is maybe just I need to call you about, or is...
Oh no, it will. There is a lot of documentation, and so if you're in the CPA right now and downloading the data, what I would say, go to the Southern Rockies webpage that I showed you, and go to the under the Adaptation Forums. There's PDFs of presentations, and it says, oh, let me go back here. Where is? Hold on, sorry, it's hidden. Okay, we're gonna go back, because there are large tables that identify what each of those fields, the code, it's coded, so it can be kind of obscure. So go to right here, it says Focal Resource Presentations and Summary. Let me get a little thingamabopper going here. The presentation, but the summary contained, it's specifically associated to the file that you're looking at right now, because those were from the from the second adaptation form. But this contains very long tables that talk about each of those fields that you're seeing there, what the original data was, how it was translated, and its source. And so I think that would really help in the interpretation of what you're looking at. And it even talks about, because there's going to be the original data or in their fields in there, and then you're going to have the coded data. So then you can see there will be 3 fields. Usually it'll have an _C, and that's the 0-1 translation. And then you have the cumulative score, and then that's been translated to a low, medium, high. And so the best place to find that right now, if you're hot on the data, is to go to those summaries on that vulnerability assessment page. So does that help?
Awesome. Thank you. It helps a lot.
Yeah, yeah. And then, yes, call me anytime. That's fine, too. So,
thank you.
Thanks. I don't see any other questions except lots of thank yous. Does anybody want to ask a question by phone or computer mic?
Oh, and I do see Steve Whiteman. Yeah, and so I will be presenting on the Riparian results, the final results, and I imagine that will be available, and so we can link to that once that becomes available. And then, yeah, as far as the others, some of them have not changed a whole lot from the initial assessment. So we'll have to look at that and see if the original presentations recordings are sufficient or not. Because for instance, for the elk and mule deer, that works, the webinar series, again on this page, that's essentially unchanged. And so that would tell you everything you need to know about the final vulnerability assessment. Okay, sorry, Mary, I overtalked you there.
No, that's fine. I didn't know that you were going to do another presentation, or I'm not sure what, but that's great.
Oh, it's for the Tamarisk Coalition meeting next week, and they asked for the Riparian assessment. They were very interested in hearing that. So it'll be one of the 5.
Yeah, if they record those presentations, let me know, and I can get it out to everybody too.
Yeah, I think they will. So
okay.
Yeah, we'll continue to update with whatever information we get.
Okay. Last call for questions.
Yeah, Randy, I like that. Yeah.
Let's hope so. Mm-hmm. Great. Well then, I guess we'll just wrap up here. Just a reminder for folks who came in late, we will send everybody a link to the recording as well as Megan's presentation slides. And Megan, anything else in closing that you'd like to say?
No, I just want to thank everybody again, and there's so much detail, and I appreciate all the effort. There's been so many people that participated in this, and from the very beginning, and I really appreciate it. And it's pretty fun to work with these things, and I really encourage you to get in contact with me or play around with them and see what you need, and do check back, because we're going to be finalizing them, and they'll say final in the file, and then you got the goods. Okay.
Great, Megan. Well, thanks, Megan, so much for presenting today, of course, and all the time and effort you've put into this beyond duty. And I'd also like to thank the audience, you guys out there, for coming today. So with that, everybody enjoy your day, and hopefully we'll see you again in the spring. Goodbye.
All right. Bye-bye.